Welcome to another episode of Deep Think. I'm Antoun Issa. Louise Adler has been one of Australia's most prominent figures in the arts for the last 3 decades. Her career spans publishing, media, higher education, and cultural curation, most recently as director of Adelaide Writers' Week. Throughout this period, she has been a powerful Jewish Australian voice for Palestine, not only speaking out, but publishing and platforming authors whose dissenting opinions on Israel have helped shape the national conversation. This has not been without its consequences. And earlier this year, Louise resigned as director of Adelaide Writers' Week after the board decided not to platform or cancelled Palestinian academic and author Randa Abdel Fattah. Following her resignation, she has been an outspoken critic on the Royal Commission on Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion, writing in deep cuts that it risked becoming a sop to tireless lobbyists. This conversation could not come at a more important time, and I'm thrilled to welcome Louise Adler to Deep Think. Welcome.
Thank you. It's an honour to be here.
I'm fascinated by the stories behind personalities and the continuation of our stories through generations that essentially provide the context of who we are, why we do what we do, and what we do with our time. And I'd like to start with your grandparents. Who were they, and where does the story of Louise Adler begin?
Well, it actually doesn't go much past my grandparents, much earlier than the grandparents, because we just don't know. We don't know what happened to them. I have very few memories handed down from my parents about their parents. My grandparents on both sides moved from Poland to metropolitan centres, which it was a very standard and traditional route. You left Poland and the pogroms and the poverty, and if you could, you moved to places like Paris and Berlin. So my father's parents moved to Paris, my mother's parents moved to Berlin. All this was in the late, probably mid-1920s. And so that's what I know about them. Let's talk about my father's family first. His father was a cap maker, casquetier was called, and working class French life in Paris as immigrant Jews. And it's important to note that they were immigrant Jews because they had early consequences during the occupation. So they're working class family, deeply secular. My father, in fact, didn't have a bar mitzvah, which was probably unusual in the Jewish community. They would have spoken Yiddish. They had a good life, I think, a good life as working class people in the 1930s in Paris. My father would have been born in 1927, I think. He had a sister, Celine. They grew up in Paris, went to school, and then the Germans occupied France, and all that changed. And my grandfather was deported in the very first roundup of Jews. Everybody knows about the, I think it was 13,000 Jews that were rounded up in the Velodrome, Veldiv it was called, in 1942. My grandfather was deported in 1941. So he was in the very first roundup of immigrant Jews who were not French citizens, taken to Bon-la-Rolande and then deported to Birkenau, where he was murdered in 1944. And my father then joined the communist section, the Jewish section of the communist resistance, at the age of 14. And that's what he did for the duration of the war. His mother was hidden by the concierge. Their apartment was sealed by the French cops, and she was given refuge by the concierge on the apartment block, who looked after her. She slept in the same bed with the concierge for the duration of the war, and that was remarkable because that concierge could have been, arrested. Was illegal. I could go into the stories. These stories are both individual and particular and very common. So my father would say there was his own personal story is not what mattered. What mattered was the collective fate of Jews in France during the Second World War, or the fate of Jews in European Jewry during the Second World War. And they wait for my grandfather to come back from Birkenau. He never comes back, obviously. And my father, his mother and sister come to Australia in 1948. My mother is born in Berlin. Her parents had come from Poland, I think late 20s or mid 20s. I don't know the exact date. again, a good life, a reasonable life, making a living, making a new life in Berlin. You make one move. My grandmother said that when Berliners were very polite. When she was pregnant with my mother, they would come up to her. She would be carrying a basket with shopping, and they would say "gnädige Frau" and ask to be help her with her basket and her shopping. The day after Kristallnacht, they pushed her off the pavement onto the road. It was so clear and so irrevocable, this clarity around anti-Semitism, the antipathy to the Jew, and the xenophobia, the rise of Nazism.
Were either of your grandparents, I'm intrigued by your father's decision to join the resistance, particularly with the communists. Were either of your grandparents politically active prior to, I guess, the onset of Nazism and World War II, or did the events of World War II
radicalise them?
Yeah.
No, my father remembers his father taking him to a May Day march already in the mid-30s. That's one of the few memories he has of his father. Whether they were they were certainly politically aware. They were progressives. They were on the left. There was no other position for the people like my parents. And my grandfather was also part of the labour movement in Poland before he left Poland. That's where their position was. I don't know about my mother's father and my mother's father in Germany during that period. They're trying to make a living. They're trying to re-establish themselves. When I think about my mother's parents, I think you went from Poland to Berlin, from Berlin to Melbourne. How many times it's the story of, it's not unique. It's every immigrant has got those stories. Refugees have got those stories, but that's the story I have. But he was committed. He was certainly active and aligned, my grandfather, certainly with Jewish communists in Australia in the late 40s, early 50s, and that was their orientation, that was their political position. How active they were, I don't know, but committed they certainly were.
I'm interested in what you think the legacy that your grandfather left you, because I just wrote a book on losing my grandfather in the Lebanese Civil War.
Yes.
And I found the writing process really a process of understanding the impact violence suffered in war has on families, both collectively and as individuals. How do you think, this horrific episode that your family experienced, which is, in your own timeline of your story,
correct,
what legacy has that left you?
On all my mother and father, my grandparents, I only knew my grandmother from my father's side because, of course, my grandfather didn't come back. But I certainly knew my mother's parents, very close, deep love, and adoring relationship. But it was always about standing up. It was always about that. And an affinity with and a understanding of what ordinary people's lives meant. I can remember it's such a small example, but my father would say when we were driving, if a cab driver was next to us, near us, he'd say, let him go. He's working to earn his living, and we aren't at this moment. There was a kind of, it's again, an old left notion of class consciousness, but it was part of what was, deeply embedded in my, with my, the meat and potatoes of daily life was a sense of the injustice of the world, the inhumanity, and the demand on us to stand up and be counted.
Right. You said in an interview with the Sydney Morning Herald in 2013 that your parents didn't view themselves as Holocaust survivors and that neither of them viewed themselves as victims. I find that really fascinating. And I have thoughts, but I want to hear your thoughts before I dive into mine.
So they would be very clear that neither my father nor my mother were in concentration camps. And they felt it was very important not to adopt that tragic, catastrophic experience for themselves, that would be misrepresenting their own experience. My mother, she says, we were lucky. We escaped. We were not brutalised. We were not beaten up. We were not, we were not enslaved. So for my mother and her parents, and they felt themselves to be very fortunate. My grandfather would close the business at 12 o'clock every day to listen to the world at noon from 1940 to 1945 to know what was going on in Europe, because he believed he still had relatives alive there and what was going to be their fate. But it wasn't their fate. And they were very clear about that in the distinction, that the respect and the kind of acknowledgement of what those who'd been incarcerated and traumatized in concentration camps, brutalized in concentration camps, was not their experience. And my father had the same thing. His view was that his role after his father's they lost his father, was to be active, to fight fascism actively.
Right.
And he never judged those who chose to kind of look after their family. He asked my grandmother's blessing before he joined the resistance in Paris, and because she could have said, "I need you to look after me and your sister Celine," she gave him her blessing when he could have been killed too. But that's where that's what they felt, and that wasn't a question of being a survivor. That was a question to actively participate in resisting.
And that's exactly the thought that I had when I read those words, which is a very similar approach that I take to, I guess, the Lebanese and Palestinian situation today. This kind of notion of collective victimization, as opposed to, being specific with who you're categorizing as victims. It's people in Gaza who are the victims today. It's people in the West Bank. It's people in South Lebanon or southern Syria or, in parts of Iran. They're the victims. They're the ones who are suffering, going through the daily, I guess, challenges of navigating survival, really. But, often being in the diaspora, you often get that victimization kind of imposed with well intentions. People who, will say, "Oh, I'm sorry about what's happening in Lebanon. I'm sorry what's happening in Palestine." Sometimes you go to the rallies here, and a lot of the speeches from people in the diaspora, Lebanese and Palestinians, will, emphasize the victimization element of it. And I've always found that problematic. And when I read your words in this 2013 article, I resonated with it, because there is also strength in resistance. There's power in resistance. And sometimes this kind of default to seeing communities that are suffering as victims and survivors, I find kind of adds a bit of there's a weakness to it. There's an implicit weakness to it. But there is strength, there is power in resisting, and there is.
But are you also saying, because I feel when I'm listening to you, that for me to describe myself as a second generation survivor, I mean, it's borrowing a tragedy and a catastrophe, whether one's sitting in Gaza or one's sitting in Dachau, it's their catastrophe, their disaster, and they're the victims. And that for me here in sunny Australia, to adopt a kind of position of me too, I am a victim too, going to be very strong. It feels like a form of porn. I'm borrowing an importance. I'm borrowing a tragedy to which I may feel greatly attached. My family and friends, your family and friends are suffering greatly, in Palestine or in southern Lebanon or wherever they are. But it's not I want to act in solidarity with that suffering, but it's not my suffering. And I feel like it's inappropriate at the very least.
It's not entirely removed. And my family migrated as a consequence of war. Your family migrated as a consequence of war. So we have had our personal lives kind of upended in certain ways. But
marked by it.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
But we're not victims, are we?
No. Not of direct violence.
No.
But also I think there needs to be a detachment between this implicit kind of meaning of victimization and weakness, because it's almost self-defeating in a way. We need to empower ourselves to see the strength in ourselves, because what fascism is so, I guess, successful at doing, both in the context of Nazi Germany and now also in the context of Israel, is that, and with the Trump administration as well, it tries to give you this impression that their power is omnipotent and their power is impenetrable and there's nothing you can do about it. There is a helplessness that they want to psychologically inflict upon you so you submit. And so the constant victimization, I guess, identity, for me is problematic in that sense that you're playing into their hands, because ultimately you are saying to yourself, I am a victim, I am weak, I can't do anything about this. And there is strength and power. And I think, to use your father's example, I mean, at 14, he's like, I'm fighting this. I don't care if they're the most powerful thing. I'm going to fight this. And there is power and strength in that. And I think that needs to be recognized in the words that we use. But moving on, this is probably a good segue, because I have been reading a lot more on the relationship between Jews and communism. And I was reading this brilliant book. I don't know if you've come across it. It's New Babylonians, it's called, by Orit Bashkin. She is an Israeli-American historian, and she wrote a book on the history of Iraqi Jews around this time, from the early 1900s to the 1950s, so covering the world, leading up to World War II and during that period. And an obvious finding that she came across doing her research was that the Communist Party was the most popular party among Iraqi Jews. And just for context, the Jewish community in Iraq was very vibrant, was very large. 35% of Baghdad was Jewish at the start of the 20th century. Can you imagine that? And they were Jews of all classes. They were aristocrats. They were in positions of parliament, in the Ottoman parliament before the World War I. The first Iraqi finance minister was Jewish. It's only 100 years ago. And there were also rural Jews who were poor and agricultural and lived in the lands in the north. So, you're talking about the OG Jews. These are the Jews of the era of Abraham, right? So,
you should also read the memoir of Avi Shlaim. I don't know if you know about Avi Shlaim. Also talks about life as a Jewish person in Baghdad.
Yeah. Coming across his work led me down this path.
Yes.
And I read this fantastic book that went into specific detail about the politics. And so...
Jews in the left.
Yeah, but even as the Zionists were trying to court the Iraqi Jews, they were playing to leftist discourse. So they were presenting... they were being rejected nonstop by the Iraqi Jews because they just, we're not going to leave our home. We're fine here. They were clear to kind of articulate that their experiences are not the experiences of the Ashkenazis in Europe. They weren't getting persecuted. But one of the tactics the Zionists used, and it's in this book, was that they tried to use this leftist discourse of, creating a socialist utopia in Palestine where you can live in egalitarian communities. So I'm really interested in given that your father's history and the political history in your family, if you can explain a bit about this relationship between various Jewish communities, whether it's in Paris or in Baghdad, and communism, and why it was so popular amongst many Jewish communities.
It's very interesting. It's one of my favourite subjects, Jews on the left. But we could also talk about the Jews that turned. When you look at the neocons in America, in the Trump, prior to Trump, a lot of them were staunch leftists who then turned into complete neocons and reactionaries. Quite interesting turn. I've always thought that's very interesting. Is it a sense persecuted? Is it as banal or as simple as people who've been persecuted? It's not the story in Baghdad, but it's certainly the story of Europe, of Eastern Europe, for example. Centuries of persecution, discrimination, and being sort of relegated, segregated in ghettos. That there's sort of long history of anti-Semitism within the Catholic Church, for example. That long story, and then becomes what is the counter to that? The counter to that is a sense of inequality and injustice, and we've got to fight that. Well, where do we find the means and the tools and the dialogue with others? It's to bring together people who feel that injustice. So working class Jews, and wealthy Jews, when it was in their interests, and they joined with left-wing organisations, progressive organisations, and with non-Jews to fight in their own place rather than the nationalist project, which would be Zionism, by the late 19th century, right? To build justice and solidarity and fight inequality in the place where they were living.
And it was their way of surviving and living in those, geographical and social spaces. And I think that was the same case in the Arab world, because as the Ottoman Empire was dismembering and everyone could see it dismembering and falling apart, I guess Jews in Iraq, as this example shows, were looking for ways in which, okay, what's the new polity going to be? What's the new system we're going to inherit that allows us to continue to participate in this society? And so I think the attraction to communism was in part owed to secularism. Okay, well, on this level, we can connect with Muslims and Christians and so forth, as well as this inherent kind of commitment to equality. Okay, if we adhere to this ideology, then we're all going to be on the same page. We're going to be equal. And I think that was the case for a lot of minorities who were looking for a way to find their place in this new Arab world.
You talked about socialist utopia. It just reminded me that when I first went to Israel, I just finished school here, year 12, and I had been part of a social Zionist youth movement. The trajectory was always, the route was you go to Israel, spend a year on kibbutz, and then you come back and you lead the youth movement. These like scouting movements with very little country activities, because we're all cosmopolitans, not all that comfortable with camping and all that sort of business, right?
Socialist utopia is great in books.
In books. Well, I like the Fran Lebowitz line, which is some people want to go back to the land, I want to go back to the hotel. That's my position myself. But anyway, my parents, of course, who were all for the life of the mind and didn't think spending a year on a kibbutz was of any worth of value at all, agreed that I could go to Israel for a couple of months, over the Christmas holidays, and then come back to university here. I really liked Israel and decided I was going to stay and go to university there. But my first revelation was getting off the plane in Israel, and I thought we'd all be dancing a horror, the Israeli dance on the tarmac, and it became so clear as you entered the airport that the Ashkenazi Jews stamp your passport and the Mizrahi Jews did the paperwork behind them, filed the paperwork, and Palestinians were cleaning the toilet. And it was a revolution. I thought I was coming to the socialist utopia, and it was a deeply racist society.
Right.
And nothing ever told me otherwise in my experience there.
It's interesting because, I think of Zionism sometimes as, the kind of the hardened edge of trauma, because trauma manifests in so many different ways, and it manifests in communities, in households in different ways. And I think this kind of sharp turn towards this kind of colonial, violent, just outwardly aggressive and, as we can see today, but it has been the case since day one, is kind of like the hardened edge of trauma. And I think of the Lebanese Christian fascists, so my mob, my community. We have fascists too. And the Phalange, and they were the Israeli allies in the Civil War.
Correct.
They committed horrific atrocities. And then, because I've also spent my time in the process of my book trying to inquire, I'm like, where did this kind of violent, aggro, just complete disregard for human life come from? And then, you just dig through a bit of the history, and there is a lot of trauma in the Lebanese Christian and the Maronite Christian communities. They suffered a lot they had the famine in World War I, where a quarter of the population were wiped out. They had massacres in 1860. They had and these are all living memories, right? These are my great grandparents, and then their grandparents, and all that trauma passes down through the DNA. And so I find that the kind of this phalangist kind of outburst of just horrific violence, which we saw in the Civil War, kind of joining up with Israel, which bears similar kind of traces of that kind of traumatic induced, outwardly violent, this assertion I find to kind of, we've been the victims for so long, we need to punch down on something or someone. Do you see that similarity? Do you see Zionism in that? Am I being too kind, or am I being honest in how I'm trying to understand how this ideology manifests itself?
I think that's a psychological interpretation. I see Zionism. I can't speak to the Phalange, the Christian, fascists or reactionaries, however you want. You would be better placed to describe them than I can. But I see the Zionist project as a nationalist project of the late 1890s. And, it's, in my humble opinion, a rewriting of history after the event, and particularly after the Six-Day War, to use the Holocaust as the pretext, as the rationale for why the State of Israel matters, and its characterisation, or its character as a Jewish state, is so important to Zionists. And that's how I see it, rather than we suffered, and they did, Jewish people did suffer from pogroms. There were massive pogroms. There was deep anti-Semitism, and indisputably the case in Eastern Europe, right? But I feel like this is a nationalist project, and it's the nationalist project before it takes up and exploits or uses, I don't want to be that harsh, but it uses the Holocaust and that catastrophe to legitimise now what we're seeing today, a genocidal project in Gaza.
Yeah, but I guess if I think about Zionism as emerging out of, the trend of what was in Europe in the 19th century, nationalism was all the talk, was all the rage. Everyone wanted their own state. Everyone wanted their own country. Everyone wanted their own republic. And this notion of an ethno-nationalist kind of Jewish state wasn't welcomed by Jewish communities, even amongst the Ashkenazis at the beginning. And, the earliest sign-ups to Zionism during the congresses of Theodor Herzl at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century were Russian Jews, because at the same time, the pogroms were mostly in Russia.
Correct.
So there was this kind of like urgent need, and even Herzl kind of like, we've got to do something to kind of rescue the Jews suffering the pogroms in Russia and Ukraine at the time.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Molly Crabapple has written The History of the Bund, which are a different faction of sort of Jewish leftism than the faction my family belongs to. But she has this great story about her grandfather. I think maybe it was a great-grandfather, that he dissented from Herzl et al. About creating the state, that Israel should be the homeland. And he took, I think, 30,000 Russians to Texas and set up a state, which I think is great, absolutely great. And so they, if only they'd stayed there.
Yeah, if only. But I wonder if, Zionism, it was inevitable that Zionism was going to go down this path of being this genocidal, rampaging, crazy kind of state that we're seeing today.
Nature of because if you identify as a Jewish state, I mean, they keep on talking about it being the only democratic state in, the Middle East. Well, actually, it's not a democratic state. If it's exclusively for Jews, the Jews are privileged in that state. That is not democracy. I think it's, really inherent in the project.
When you arrived in Israel in 1972 and you saw the kind of delineation of, I guess, hierarchy of human beings based on both race and religion, is that when your view of Israel and Zionism really started to diverge and change from what you imagined it to be?
Totally. It was very clear. It was, but at the same time, I have to be honest and say at the same time, I'm naive politically. I didn't get involved politically, and when I was there, I was going to university. Learning the language. There was instances where it became very clear to me. When you first arrive there, you go to Ulpan. It's the language school. You have to go, if you want to get into university, you have to be able to speak, to read Hebrew, learn, speak Hebrew. So you go to a school, and I was living I was at the Hebrew University, living in halls of residence at Mount Scopus Hill. It was, I'm probably describing it inaccurately, but that's where I was. And I can remember that the textbook we used for learning Hebrew had images of Arabs, an Arab with scales weighing out maybe beans or rice or something, scales. It was something out of, Der Stürmer. It was absolutely, if it was about Jews, you would call it blatantly an anti-Semitic cartoon. And this was of an Arab. And that was the characterization. This is part of your absorption, it was called, into Israeli society, was to understand this is what racism looks like.
Right.
It was so clear to me in this workbook you got, that here the characterization, talk about Islamophobia, talk about racism, was very, very clear.
It's a racial hierarchy that's kind of imprinted into Israeli minds from the get-go, and even among Zionists, abroad in the colleges that they all grow up in. It's like there's this kind of
Till we get to, we talk about human animals in
Right.
Gaza.
But
That's
they've
where it
always
comes.
thought of
They've
Arabs as
always-
human animals because of the caricatures, because of the racism that's
Correct.
kind of embedded in their
Correct.
education system from the
And the
get-go.
idea that we're part of the West. We're not part of the Orient. We're actually Western. This little island in the middle of the Middle East. We aren't really part of this place.
Right.
Well, that's crazy. Couldn't be.
Which kind of leads me to, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, which is that I don't consider Zionism to be, and I'm welcome to dispute me, but I don't consider Zionism to be a Jewish supremacist ideology. I consider it to be an Ashkenazi supremacist ideology.
Well, except that, Bibi Netanyahu's supporters come
From the Mizrahi.
From the Mizrahi Jews.
Because they're trying to and I've also been trying to unpack this mindset, and I haven't arrived at a conclusion, but, what do you, if you're brought up in a society where everything Arab is demonized to the point where Mizrahi is invented as a term, so you don't even recognize your own Arab heritage and your own Arab roots. Those Jews were from Iraq or Syria or Morocco or Egypt or Yemen, where their families and lineages go back centuries. And you want to deny all of that in a society that looks upon that heritage as we're saying before, human animals. You're not worthy. And so this is a community now that's been brought up in this. And for them to fit in, they had to do everything they possibly can to disregard and discard their own heritage. It is self-loathing to the absolute extreme, but self-loathing with a necessity to survive in this society. And also the Mizrahi are not, they weren't given the best lands during the early stages of colonization in Israel. A lot of them moved to the West Bank because West Bank had more affordable properties. A lot of them are in the northern parts where they're getting hit from Lebanon constantly, and they're complaining all the time they don't get enough support from the state. The best lands in the middle and the centers of power of Israel around Tel Aviv and the coast are where the Ashkenazis kind of set up shop.
Correct.
And this is a hierarchy that most people don't know about, that the hierarchy within Israel amongst Jews and where Jews came from matters, because it's, that racial hierarchy doesn't just, the Palestinians and the Arabs are the lowest end of the rung, but then the Arab Jews are just above that. And we don't like Arabs, so we call them Mizrahi. So that's my understanding of why I think the Mizrahi have become so incredibly anti-Arab, even though they are Arab to their roots. And that's a community that's been, kind of brainwashed into thinking that way.
Absolutely.
You went to Columbia in New York and you studied under Edward Said, and I'm very jealous.
I'm sorry.
I wish I was born 3 decades earlier.
300 years ago.
Probably the most influential Palestinian thinker post-1948.
Yes.
What was that like?
It was great. Okay, I have to wind back a little bit and say that I'd done 2.5 years at Hebrew and Tel Aviv University, and the Yom Kippur War broke out. My parents came to visit, and my parents certainly didn't want to be in a war, so we all went off to the UK, to London. And I was 20 years old, or however old I was. I was certainly, Oxford said, we won't accept any credit, we don't recognise Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University. You'll have to start your BA again. And Reading University said, you can come here and, we'll accept your 2.5 years of credit, whatever. Anyway, I finished my BA and I wanted to do my PhD. And I wanted to focus on Marxist aesthetics. This is quite arcane, but I wanted to know why Marxist, because I shared the view, and Marxist literary theory says that the realist novel of the 19th century is the best novel. That's the kind of high point of literary culture, whether it's Balzac or Dickens or George Eliot or Stendhal. That's where it is, and I agree with that. Really, it's probably viewed as reactionary at this point, but anyway, whatever. In those days, that's what we believe in. So I felt like I'd had enough of Britain, and this is the mid-70s, and it's bleak as. And the xenophobia was extraordinary. I'd come out of the Middle East, whatever, island of, Ashkenazi life I'd experienced in Israel. It was absolutely counter to this constipated, inward-looking, introverted British culture. There was just none of the exhilaration, the energy, the dynamism of the Middle East. It was just... And I remember my first day, I was going to stay in the halls of residence at Reading University, And dinner that day was spam fritters, baked beans, and mashed potatoes. And I thought, I can't. This I cannot do. So I moved to London. I would commute to Reading, right? Anyway, so I'd have this seminar with Eagleton, entirely intimidating seminar with Eagleton. And I thought, I don't really want to stay in England any longer. I had remembered it was the period where the petrodollar came into being, and you would have stretch limos coming, parking outside Marks and Spencer's, and the ladies in their full burqas would come out and go into Marks and Spencer's. And the animosity and the rudeness with which British, salespeople would treat them, the loathing for the Arab just struck, for where I had been, it just struck me as awful, and I didn't want to stay there any longer. So I applied to a variety of universities. I got a scholarship, and I'd known of Edward Said's work, but the world of cultural theory was divided into those who took the French, the French theorists, or the continental theorists, as the Brits would call them, or the English theorists, and so in England at that time, there was no interest in people like Michel Foucault, that, the English intellectual life, or they were not interested in characters like that. So I was holding on to my Marxist aesthetics thesis idea. I knew about Said, and I asked if he would supervise my thesis. He was willing to do it. And it was two, one short Semite and a tall Semite, very handsome, charismatic Edward Said, and a short little intense Jewish wannabe intellectuals. And I said, I want to do my thesis on Lukács and Marxist aesthetics. And he said, that's a great supervisor. Never mind everything else he had going for him. A great supervisor. He said, really interesting project, Louise. That'll take you 40 years. How about you work on Michel Foucault? And he was a practical, and he wanted me to be his teaching assistant for 3 years.
Wow.
And that was fantastic. He was a wonderful patron. He was an intellectual mentor, very supportive of me. He was just great. And I remember it was my first moment, and we talked. He had me went there for dinner. I'm not saying I was not close. It was a student professor relationship. But I remember going there for dinner once. We're talking about the Middle East, Palestine, and he talked about the Jews. And I said, Edward, when you talk about the Jews, you leave no space for people like me, progressive Jews like me, who are not, do not share this view. And he was sort of dismissive. And it took me probably another 30 years to read Muhammad al-Kurd talking about why he talks about Jews and why it is important to recognise the Jewish nature of the State of Israel, for me to actually understand that Said was correct. He was right. It's whatever position I want to take personally, or other individual Jewish anti-Zionists want to take, he's right about the character and nature of the State of Israel and what's the problem of the Zionist project, the anti-democratic project.
And why is essentializing Jews in that?
Say that again?
Why is essentializing Jews in that, or
correct,
focusing on the Jewish nature of the State of Israel? But why is that necessary?
Why is it necessary? Because we're seeing it. We're seeing it right now in the context of the Royal Commission. This is a propaganda project to silence critics of Israel, and what's the way through that? Is to say that we're going to silence people. We're going to demonize people who are supportive of who are in solidarity with the Palestinian movement, and we're going to demonize those people who support them by calling them anti-Semites, conflating one's Jewish identity with support for Israel.
Was your encounter with Edward Said, I guess, the first encounter with a Palestinian up close where you had a working relationship for several years?
Probably, yes.
Yeah. And how did that shape, I guess, your outlook towards Israel and Palestine going forward? Knowing that, given your background and the context that you came from, going to Israel, seeing the caricatures of Arabs, being repelled by it, but not having that personal, I guess, connection to the Palestinian experience. How did that influence you, having, I guess, the most significant Palestinian of the 20th century, one of the most significant, in close proximity?
Clarified my position, I guess, hardened my position, clarified my position. Remember, he was called the Professor of Terror. I think it was a bit later when he throws a stone at a guard in a tower, and it's plastered all over the Western media as if this is a total affront. I understood the gesture, empty gesture, but symbolic gesture at the same time, of rage about the injustice. What does Edward Said say? We're the victims of the victims, and we're their victims. I think, and the demonization of Said. And I think he was part of working on the speech that Arafat gave at the UN, if I remember correctly. And so I was around that. I don't remember having deep discussions with him throughout that period. He had written Orientalism. That was very important. I mean, it was probably the first time that, the West was called out or described for intellectuals, if you like, on now what we would call the othering of the Arab and what that meant, what the political and cultural consequences of that meant, and how deeply embedded that was in the Western view of, of the East, of the Orient,
Did you see parallels? Oh, I guess in hindsight and reflection, do you see parallels in, your, support or your recognition of the Palestinian perspective during that time when you're working with Edward Said? And I guess your father's kind of desire for resistance.
Absolutely.
Against a power.
About active resistance.
Yeah.
I understand that. He always argued about that.
Right.
Non-violent resistance, that would have got you nowhere in Paris in 1941.
Right. But this is the fascinating, this is why I was kind of asking you about, Edward Said's point about essentializing Jews and the Jewish nature with the state of Israel. And I completely understand that, Jewishness is weaponized by the state of Israel and their supporters in order to maintain this perpetual victim status. But there is another Jewish narrative and another Jewish story coming out of World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, and that is social justice, resistance against powers that seem impossible, and adherence to, common, universal humanity, being able to identify who is clearly being oppressed and who is clearly the oppressor. I mean, that awareness comes from,
Correct.
This is me interpreting, this last 45 minutes of our conversation. This is why I started this conversation with the story of Louise Adler with her grandparents and her parents, because I feel like we inherit a lot of that, even subconsciously from our parents. And for me, it doesn't strike me as a surprise that here you are in the 1970s standing with Edward Said, clearly identifying who is the oppressor and the oppressed in the Israel-Palestine context. And you're the daughter of a father who was clearly in that mode at a time in Europe when that wasn't recognized and that wasn't clear, and people weren't standing with the Jews and the moment when they were being slaughtered. And I think that's just my interpretation. I think that's just there's clarity in, knowing Louise Adler in the last bit. But I want to segue now. Do you want to say?
Can I pause for a minute to say you make me cry? You make me cry, Antoun, because it's quite amazing. Thank you.
Okay, well, then let's segue to the Royal Commission, which you've been very passionate and vocal about. And I guess for me, it's been astonishing. I read your piece. Obviously, I edited your piece and I published your piece.
Yes, you edited my piece, Antoun.
Yes. But I came across this quote by Al-Jahiz. He is an old Arab Muslim poet and theologian of the 8th century or the 9th century. And he wrote this wonderful line. He was an empiricist. He was a Muslim empiricist. And he argued that observation compels the observer. And he said that every viewpoint that is disproved by observation is the most egregious blunder and the most ridiculous conviction, meaning the viewpoint. And that's all I can think of when I listen to, the pro-Israel supporters and the Zionists at the Royal Commission, one after the other, doing whatever they can to kind of mischaracterize what is clearly, by observation standards, a genocide and human atrocities, and trying to reverse and spin it into making themselves out to be the victims. For me, I can't get it out of my head, but to think that this is the most egregious blunder and the most ridiculous conviction to have, that you are trying to convince me that our observation, which is the greatest evidence of all, is somehow inaccurate.
But perhaps, the reason for their anxiety and their fearfulness is because they cannot escape the images and the evidence of the genocide that's occurring. And that perhaps if I was wedded wholeheartedly to the Zionist project as they are, I would also be fearful and anxious and not able to sleep at night. There's a moral injury that's involved in turning your eyes away from barbarism and atrocity after atrocity.
Mm. Yes, indeed. But I guess but to what end?
What end? The end is very, to me, forgive me, it's very clear. This is a propaganda exercise to silence critics of Israel. And it's not working. That's why it's becoming more and more hysterical with each hearing, it seems to me. The piling on of so-called lived experience, which is not to say that we should accept in any way any form of racism, whether it's anti-Semitism or I don't think that is not to kind of rehearse a cliche or a kind of, mantra, a given. It should be a given in our society. That's why I think a Royal Commission into Racism would have been of much more value and much more important and much more constructive if one believes in social cohesion than this particular endeavour, which is about disrupting cohesion.
Right.
It's about, and there's an old joke in the Jewish community, which is, will this be good for the Jews? Well, in my humble opinion, this Royal Commission will not be good for the Jews. This exceptionalising of the Jewish experience or their view of what constitutes being Jewish in this country will actually divide and divide people rather than bring people to a sense of empathy and humanity and shared humanity for one another.
Right. I'm not necessarily surprised by the drive and the actions of the pro-Israel lobby and their supporters, because as far as I'm concerned, if you're looking back to the kind of Al-Jahi's kind of example, if you are trying to deny what is obvious and you are kind of trying to camouflage a genocide, then you're already in the camp of an extremist. Your mindset is already so extreme that nothing would surprise me if you're at that state. What is surprising, I think, to many in Australia who are just kind of like casual observers of what's going on, domestically as well as internationally, is that the Australian political and elites and the political establishment and the media establishment all just seem to be kind of acting passive while the pro-Israel lobby is pushing for this, whether it's criminalising speech and criticism of Israel with new hate speech laws, and they're probably going to have more recommendations after this Royal Commission. The fact that we even have a Royal Commission and it hasn't actually been used to interrogate the causes of Bondi. Somehow Bondi, I feel like, has been forgotten in this entire commission that was set up for Bondi. Instead, it's been an entire platform to disparage Palestine, to kind of propagate, I guess, a narrative that Israel itself is propagating. The fact that our institutions just seem to be folding and allowing it to happen, whether it's at the political level, whether it's APRA, the healthcare regulator, whether it's employers sacking their employees for daring to kind of raise, kind of solidarity with the Palestinians wearing a pin. And I guess what you experienced it yourself with Adelaide Writers' Week. What is your observation of why you think the political and the establishment, the institutions, just seem to be so
quiescent? I find it remarkable. Well, I remember there was an ad in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, I think probably straight after October the 7th, we abhor, we condemn, the attack, on October the 7th. We condemn anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. 500 captains of industry signed on to that advertisement. Well, if you're asked by someone, will you condemn anti-Semitism? You've got a problem. You're going to say, no, actually, I'm not going to sign that. Yes. So I think that it was the way in which, for example, the lobby galvanised every area of, and they're very well organised. All credit, one has to admire the energy and the purpose and the resources they put into creating the conditions for a Royal Commission. But I think all of that created the context where it was impossible to resist having a Royal Commission. I think Albanese tried valiantly for about 3 weeks to resist the proposition, to say the real question around Bondi is it was an intelligence failure. Let's think deeply and let's investigate what that was about.
And that has been interrogated at all in this Royal Commission?
Not at all.
Right.
Nor I think we've had one person talk about neo-Nazism in this country, where if you want to talk about anti-Semitism, I think your real problem is not with Palestinians, people in solidarity with plight of Palestinians.
Many of them are Jews, I would add.
Correct. Many who are Jewish, right? But it's actually, with the rise of Nazis in Australia. But we're not giving that any attention because, it's like Dominic Perrottet, who put on a Nazi uniform for fun. And, the ECAJ and the Zionist Federation said, oh, he's just a young man. How come that's okay?
Right. Yeah.
So I do not understand. I'm sorry, I drifted from your question, which is, I think it's in a way, is it as crude? And I'm asking the question because I don't know the answer. A government that's wants to kind of stifle or do away with criticism that the Murdoch press, and we know that they're not entirely effective, they're not able to affect, for example, electoral fortunes. But there's something about the Murdoch press, the lobby, and their,
that they're afraid of.
Their friends, that they're frightened of. Now, we've got 2 electorates in New South Wales where the Jewish vote matters. There's only 120,000 Jews that live in Australia. There are 750 people of Muslim faith in this country. I do not understand the weight here.
Yeah. They're probably stuck in it. As far as I can understand, they're stuck in a default that they haven't switched on to yet. And for all their efforts, the pro-Israel lobby plus the media establishment plus the political establishment all trying to kind of change the narrative, 8 in 10 Australians, according to a Pew Research poll, still view Israel negatively. That means, if you want to break that down, a Greens voter, a Labor voter, a coalition voter, and a One Nation voter are more likely than not to look at Israel and be like, you know what? No, thanks. Not my thing.
So the interesting thing is, for me, what I take away from it is, for all their efforts, it's not working.
Not working.
We had 300,000 people march across.
That's where the criminalisation is coming through. That's why they're turning to the criminalisation
Correct.
aspect.
But it's not working. For all of those efforts, for the handbooks on anti-Semitism, the march through the institutions, whether it's the universities or it's the arts or it's the media, all of this is sort of, I think that this is out of fear that they haven't managed to stifle criticism of Israel.
No.
They haven't managed to stop people saying what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank is unacceptable.
Because as Al-Jahi says, observation compels the observer. We have observed on our phones. We have seen the horrors on our phones. That can't be unseen. No matter what you do, it can't be unseen. But then I do want to leave on a more positive note, because things do seem to be changing. And change is incremental. It's slow, but it happens. And not just outside Jewish communities, but within them. A recent poll showed that Zoran Mamdani is more popular among American Jews than Benjamin Netanyahu. And just to remember, Mamdani ran on a clear pro-Palestine platform. Many New York Jews helped to elect Mamdani. You've got the likes of Zach Polanski, a British Jew who is now leading the UK Greens, and they are surging in the UK. And we've seen the emergence of Jewish Council here, which you are a part of in Australia. So I guess to connect all the threads of the discussion today, are we seeing the revival of a Jewish left?
Well, I hope you're right, Antoun, that there is, we're seeing the seeds of a diversity of views within the Jewish community, the re-enlivenment, if you like, or the revitalisation of the Jewish left in Australia. Jewish Council, there are other organisations that are dissenting from the mainstream, what we would call legacy, representative bodies of the mainstream of the Jewish community. But most of the Jewish community here are rusted on Zionists, and I think that's not going to change in the near future. But there are seeds. There are lots of people who are now interested, for example, in what the Jewish Council is doing. That's grounds for hope.
And he's hoping.
If only.
If only. Louise, this has been. I said I want to go for another 3 hours, but we can't.
We can't.
Our crew's telling us we have to be out of this studio quickly in the next few minutes. So, but thank you so much.
A pleasure.
for coming to speak
pleasure.
on Deep Think.
Oh,
And
am I interrupting you while you're doing this?
I mean,
Are we
no,
on?
we can keep going, but I just want to.
No. I mean, am I interrupting you while you're closing?
Yeah.
Or are you going to finish this on your own?
I was going to finish on my book because I was going to say.
Yeah, much better. No, I'm because I keep interrupting you. So if we're on film, then I should shut up. But if we're not, then I can say thank you.
I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. And if you want to support us, head over to deepcutnews.com/subscribe. Subscribe to us, support independent media. We need every bit of support to keep going and functioning and resisting. It's all necessary. So thank you.